Arthur Vance believed that silence had a texture. In his penthouse, a sterile expanse of glass and steel perched high above the city, the silence was smooth and cold, like a polished marble slab. It was the silence of absence, of a life meticulously curated to avoid the messiness of emotion. It echoed in the vast, empty spaces where his wife Eleanor's laughter used to be, a ghost of a sound that the hum of the city below could never quite erase. His world was a fortress of wealth, built brick by brick with every successful acquisition and every ruthless decision. But within its walls, he was the sole prisoner, haunted by the quiet dignity of a memory. The glow of chandeliers was a poor substitute for the light that had once been in his life. He moved through his days with a mechanical precision, his heart encased in something as cold and hard as the diamonds on his watch. Success was his armor, and loneliness was the price he paid for it. Miles below, in the cavernous, darkened halls of Vance Tower, Samuel worked in a different kind of silence. His was a textured quiet, too, but it was the soft, worn silence of labor. It was in the gentle swish of his mop against the gleaming floors, the quiet click of a light switch, the tired sigh he let out as he leaned against his cart. His silence was not empty, it was full. It was filled with the steady, rhythmic beat of a heart that worked for someone else. Tucked into his worn wallet was a small, creased photograph of his granddaughter, Lily, her smile a small sun in his world of shadows. He would pull it out in the lonely hours past midnight, and the silence would fill with a quiet warmth, a purpose that made the ache in his back and the weariness in his bones feel like a worthy sacrifice. He was invisible to the titans who strode these halls by day, a ghost who came alive only after they were gone, polishing their world while his own remained tucked away in the quiet corners of the city. One night, the silence in Arthur's penthouse became unbearable. It pressed in on him, a physical weight on his chest. Sleep was a distant country he could no longer visit. Driven by an impulse he didn't understand, he descended from his glass tower and walked the empty corridors of his own company. The building was a sleeping giant, its daytime roar of commerce muted to a low electronic hum. He ran a hand along the cool granite of a wall, a stranger in his own kingdom. He was the king of this domain, yet he felt like a trespasser in the stillness. As he rounded a corner on the 17th floor, a sound broke the perfect quiet. It was small, almost imperceptible. A soft, rhythmic exhalation, like a gentle tide. It came from a supply closet, the door left slightly ajar. A flicker of irritation, quickly replaced by a cold curiosity, moved through him. He expected to find some slacking employee, a security guard napping on the job. He pushed the door open. The sight before him was not what he expected. It was not an image of laziness, but one of profound exhaustion. There, on a makeshift bed of flattened cardboard boxes, lay the night janitor. The man's weathered face, etched with lines of worry and fatigue, was slack in sleep. One hand was curled near his chest, as if protecting something precious. His uniform was worn but immaculate. He was not hiding, he was simply finding a moment of rest in a world that clearly offered him few. Arthur stood frozen in the doorway. The icy air of the office seemed to crystallize around the small, warm space of the closet. He saw the man's chest rise and fall, a fragile rhythm against the building's monolithic silence. Something inside Arthur, something that had been frozen for years, cracked. This was not a violation of company policy. This was a story, and he was standing on the first page. He saw a quiet dignity in the man's posture, a resilience that felt more real and more powerful than any stock price or market valuation. He backed away slowly, pulling the door almost closed, leaving just a sliver of darkness. He did not want to disturb the man's stolen peace. He returned to the elevator, but as he ascended back to his sterile sky palace, he was no longer alone. The image of the sleeping janitor came with him, a quiet indictment of the world he had built. The cold silence of his penthouse felt different now. It no longer felt empty, it felt obscene. The next morning, the image was still seared into his mind. It followed him through his morning coffee, through the financial reports that seemed utterly meaningless. The sleeping man on the cardboard floor had become a splinter in his soul. He called his head of human resources. "I need the file for the janitorial staff," he said, his voice flat, betraying none of the strange turmoil within. Specifically, the night crew. Within the hour, he had the file. Samuel Miller. Employed for 7 years. A spotless record. No commendations, no complaints. A ghost in the machine. He had a listed address in a part of the city Arthur only ever flew over in his helicopter. He had a daughter listed as his emergency contact. There was nothing remarkable in the black and white data, nothing to explain the profound humanity he had witnessed in the dim light of a supply closet. Arthur knew he could not summon the man to his office. The power imbalance would be a chasm between them, turning concern into interrogation. It had to be different. He needed to dismantle the walls of his own making, to meet him on level ground. He looked at his schedule, a series of high-stakes meetings and cold calculations, and with a decisive stroke of his pen, he cleared his morning. He found Samuel in the small, sterile break room on the ground floor, just as his shift was ending. The man was carefully pouring sugar into a styrofoam cup of coffee, his movements deliberate and weary. Arthur approached, his expensive suit feeling like a costume. "Samuel," he said softly. Samuel turned, his eyes widening slightly in recognition of the company's CEO. A flicker of fear, quickly masked by a professional calm, crossed his face. He straightened his back, a subtle armor of dignity clicking into place. "Mr. Vance." "Good morning, sir." "Arthur, please," he said, gesturing to the empty chair opposite. "May I join you?" Samuel hesitated, then gave a slow, cautious nod. He sat, his hands wrapped around the cheap cup as if for warmth. The silence between them was thick with the unspoken hierarchy that defined their lives. Arthur was the one who was supposed to break it. "I was walking through the building late last night," Arthur began, his voice even. He saw Samuel's knuckles whiten around the cup. "I saw you in the supply closet." The janitor's gaze dropped to the table. A faint flush of shame colored his weathered cheeks. He prepared for the inevitable, for the cold dismissal, the lecture on company property. He braced himself. "I'm so sorry, sir," Samuel said, his voice low but steady. "It will not happen again. I was just resting my eyes for a moment." "You looked exhausted," Arthur said, and the simple observation, devoid of accusation, was so unexpected that Samuel looked up, his eyes filled with a weary confusion. "I'm not angry, Samuel. I'm concerned." That one word, concerned, was a key turning a lock that had been rusted shut for years. It was not a word Samuel was used to hearing, especially not from a man who lived in the sky. Something in Arthur's earnest gaze told him this was not a trap. Slowly, haltingly, the story began to emerge. It was not a plea for pity, but a simple statement of fact, delivered with the same quiet dignity with which he mopped the floors. He spoke of his 2 jobs, this one at night, and another during the day, loading trucks at a warehouse. He spoke of his daughter, Sarah, a nurse who worked the night shift at the city hospital. And he spoke of Lily. "My granddaughter," Samuel said, and for the first time, a light broke through the fatigue in his eyes. She has a weakness in her lungs. The treatments are expensive. Sarah works so hard, but it's never quite enough." He explained the geography of his life. The bus ride home took an hour and a half. The warehouse job started at dawn. By sleeping for a few hours in the closet, he saved 3 hours of travel. 3 hours he could spend with Lily in the morning before her mother got home from the hospital and he had to leave for his second job. It was the only time they had. "I read to her," Samuel said, a soft smile touching his lips. "We have a book about a bear who gets lost in the stars. It's her favorite." He was not just resting his eyes. He was buying time. He was trading his own rest for a few precious moments in a world of starlit bears and a little girl's smile. Arthur listened, and the walls of his glass fortress crumbled to dust. He thought of his own life, a sterile expanse of time bought with money, and how he had nothing to fill it with. This man, with nothing, was buying moments of pure, unadulterated love. A profound sense of shame washed over Arthur. Not for Samuel, but for himself. For the hollowness he had mistaken for strength. He found himself speaking, the words coming from a place he thought had died with Eleanor. "I lost my wife 5 years ago," he said, the admission a crack in his own polished facade. "This company, it was all I had left. I poured everything into it. I think I forgot how to be anything other than a CEO." An understanding passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of two different kinds of loss, two different kinds of emptiness. The chasm between the billionaire and the janitor narrowed, bridged by the simple, fragile truths of human experience. "She sounds like she was a wonderful woman," Samuel said quietly, with a simple sincerity that struck Arthur more than any elaborate condolence ever had. Arthur just nodded, unable to speak past the lump forming in his throat. This became their new routine. Not every day, but often enough. Arthur would find reasons to be in the building early, to share a coffee with Samuel before he left. He learned that Lily loved the color yellow. He learned that Samuel used to be a carpenter before his hands grew too stiff. He learned about the quiet nobility of a man who measured his wealth not in dollars, but in the minutes he could steal to read to his granddaughter. In turn, Samuel learned about Arthur. He learned that the CEO's favorite color had been Eleanor's favorite, a deep shade of blue. He learned that Arthur kept a single, dried rose on his desk, a memento from their first date. He saw not a titan of industry, but a man adrift in a sea of grief, clinging to the wreckage of a life he once loved. He saw the real man beneath the billion-dollar armor. One morning, as a cold rain lashed against the windows of the break room, Arthur saw Samuel shiver in his thin jacket. "You're going to catch your death in that," Arthur said, his voice laced with genuine worry. "It does the job," Samuel replied with a shrug, too proud to admit the cold had seeped deep into his bones. The next day, Arthur arrived with a thick, woolen coat, dark gray and impeccably made. It was one of his own, but it was simple, unadorned with any flashy labels. He held it out. "I was clearing out my closet. This doesn't fit me anymore. I thought of you." It was a lie, a small, kind deception to preserve the other man's pride. Samuel looked at the coat, then at Arthur. He saw the truth in the CEO's eyes, the sincere offering that went beyond charity. It was a gesture of friendship. With a grateful, trembling hand, he accepted it. The warmth of the coat was immediate, a shield against the morning's icy air. But it was the warmth of the gesture that reached deeper, thawing something frozen within him. Their friendship became a quiet ritual, a small island of authenticity in the corporate sea. But the currents of that sea were treacherous, and they were being watched. Marcus Thorne was a man who navigated the world by observing its power dynamics. He was a mid-level manager with a sharp suit and an even sharper ambition. He believed in a world of clear hierarchies, of predators and prey, of winners and losers. To him, kindness was a weakness and sentiment was a tool for manipulation. He had noticed the CEO's strange new habit, the early morning coffees with the night janitor. It didn't make sense. It violated the unwritten rules of the tower. His suspicion festered, turning into a dark conviction. The janitor had to be playing an angle. He was likely feeding some sob story to the grieving, vulnerable CEO, looking for a handout, a promotion, a way to game the system. Marcus saw it as his duty, to the company, and to his own career, to expose it. One morning, he waited. He hid in the shadows of the parking garage, his phone clutched in his hand like a weapon. He watched as Arthur and Samuel emerged from the building together, talking like old friends. He saw Arthur gesture toward his sleek, black sedan. He saw Samuel hesitate, then accept the offer of a ride. Marcus raised his phone. The click of the shutter was silent, but the image it captured was loud. The billionaire CEO opening the door of his luxury car for the janitor. It was perfect. It was damning. He didn't leak it to the press. That was too risky. Instead, he chose a more insidious route. He sent the photo from an anonymous email address to a few of the office's most notorious gossips. The subject line was simple: guess who's getting special treatment? The poison spread quickly. By midday, the whispers had become a roar that echoed through the cubicles and hallways. The photo was forwarded, screenshotted, and discussed in hushed, cruel tones by the coffee machine. The narrative Marcus had crafted took root and grew wild. Samuel Miller, the lowly janitor, was a master manipulator. A gold digger in a janitor's uniform. He was taking advantage of the poor, lonely CEO. Samuel felt the shift immediately. The polite nods he usually received from daytime employees were replaced with cold stares and derisive smirks. Two secretaries fell silent as he walked past, their laughter hanging in the air like smoke. Someone had taped a picture of a crown above the door to the supply closet. The humiliation was a physical blow. It struck him harder than any physical hardship ever had. His poverty had been his reality, but his dignity had been his fortress. Now, they were tearing it down, stone by stone. The kindness he had received from Arthur, a small, warm light in his life, had been twisted into something ugly and transactional. That evening, he waited for Arthur by the service elevator, his face a mask of pained resolve. The warm coat felt heavy on his shoulders now, like a mark of shame. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice formal, the easy camaraderie of the past weeks gone. "I cannot accept your rides anymore. We cannot talk like this." Arthur saw the deep hurt in the older man's eyes. "Samuel, what is it? What's wrong?" "They are talking," Samuel said, his voice barely a whisper. They think I am using you. That your kindness is something I schemed to get. My good name is all I have, sir. I cannot lose it." He was not angry. He was heartbroken. He felt he had inadvertently brought this shame upon Arthur, and upon himself. To protect them both, he had to rebuild the wall between their worlds. "Please," Samuel said, his voice cracking slightly. "It is better this way." Before Arthur could respond, Samuel turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped, the weight of the world back upon them. He was gone, retreating into the silent, invisible role he had occupied for years. Arthur stood alone in the hallway, the silence returning, but this time it was not cold or empty. It was hot. It was the silence of rage. He was not angry at Samuel. He was furious with the cynical, poison culture that he had allowed to fester in the halls of his own company. The whispers and the smirks were a reflection of a world he had helped build, a world where kindness was suspicious and vulnerability was a weakness. He saw Marcus Thorne's ambition behind it all, a symptom of the disease. The pain on Samuel's face was a mirror, showing him the man he had been for 5 years, cold, distant, and judgmental. He had built a kingdom of suspicion, and now it had wounded the one person who had reminded him how to be human. He would not let it stand. The next morning, an email went out to every employee of Vance Industries. Subject: mandatory all-hands meeting. 10 a.m. sharp. The speculation was rampant. Heads were going to roll. The CEO was furious. At 10 o'clock, the main auditorium was packed. A nervous energy crackled in the air. Marcus Thorne sat in the third row, a smug, confident look on his face. He believed he was about to be rewarded for his vigilance. Arthur Vance walked onto the stage. He looked different. The polished, impenetrable armor of the CEO was gone. His eyes were clear and direct, holding a fire no one had ever seen there before. He walked to the podium but didn't speak immediately. He just looked out at the sea of faces. Then, the massive screen behind him lit up. It was the photo. The CEO holding the car door for the janitor. A collective gasp went through the room. "I'm sure many of you have seen this," Arthur began, his voice calm, but carrying an immense weight. "I'm sure many of you have talked about it. You've drawn conclusions. You've crafted a story." He looked around the room, his gaze lingering for a moment on Marcus, who now looked distinctly uncomfortable. "But you don't know the story," Arthur continued. "So today, I'm going to tell you one. It's about a man named Samuel Miller." For the next 10 minutes, Arthur Vance laid his soul bare for his company to see. He told them everything. He told them about finding Samuel asleep on a bed of cardboard, not out of laziness, but because he worked 2 jobs. He told them about Samuel's granddaughter, Lily, and her medical bills. He told them about the 3 hours of sleep sacrificed for 1 hour of reading about a bear who traveled the stars. "This man," Arthur said, his voice ringing with passion, "shows more dedication, more integrity, and more loyalty in a single shift than I've seen in a lifetime of boardroom meetings. He works to keep his family together. He works for love." And what did we, as a company, do? We rewarded that quiet dignity with suspicion. We rewarded his sacrifice with cruel gossip. The auditorium was utterly silent. Shame was a palpable thing, thick in the air. "This isn't about him," Arthur said, his voice dropping slightly. "This is about us. It's about me. For years, this company has mirrored my own emptiness. We've valued profit over people. We've rewarded ambition over integrity. I built a house with no heart inside it." He paused, taking a deep breath. "That changes today. I was reminded by a good man that our greatest asset isn't our market share, it's our people. It's their stories, their struggles, their quiet acts of courage every day." He then announced the creation of the Eleanor Vance Employee Assistance Fund, a multi-million-dollar initiative to provide emergency aid, childcare subsidies, and educational grants to any employee in need. "Named for my late wife," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "who believed that kindness was the only investment that always paid dividends." He had not fired anyone. He had not shamed anyone by name. He had done something far more powerful. He had held up a mirror, and forced them all to see their own reflection. He ended the meeting and walked off the stage, leaving a stunned and humbled silence in his wake. Samuel had watched the broadcast on a small television in a basement utility room, his heart pounding in his chest. He was overwhelmed, tears streaming down his weathered face. He felt not vindicated, but seen. For the first time in his life, he felt truly seen. Later, Arthur found him by his cleaning cart, the office now quiet after the day's emotional storm. Samuel looked up, his eyes full of a gratitude that words could not express. The wall between them was gone, dismantled not by shame, but by a grand, public act of empathy. "You didn't have to do that," Samuel whispered. "Yes, I did," Arthur replied, his voice soft. "You reminded me of what it means to have something worth fighting for. Thank you." Their handshake was not one between a boss and an employee. It was a bond between 2 men who had, in their own ways, saved each other. 1 year later, the silence in Arthur Vance's penthouse was different. It was no longer cold and sterile. It was a peaceful quiet, filled with the soft sounds of a life rebuilt. The city lights outside seemed warmer, less lonely. Vance Tower had changed, too. The atmosphere was no longer one of cold ambition, but of a shared, human purpose. The Eleanor Vance Fund had helped dozens of families, becoming a source of pride for the entire company. Samuel Miller was no longer the night janitor. He had protested, insisting he was not looking for a reward, but Arthur had been firm. This was not a reward, it was a recognition of his true worth. He created a new position for Samuel, a role that had never existed before, employee wellness liaison. Samuel was now the heart of the assistance fund, the man who met with employees in need, who listened to their stories with the same quiet empathy he had shown all his life. He was a natural. His worn, kind face was a symbol of the company's new soul. The final scene of their transformation did not take place in a boardroom or a penthouse. It took place on a bright Saturday afternoon in a public park. Arthur, dressed in simple slacks and a sweater, was pushing a laughing little girl on a swing. Her name was Lily, and her lungs were strong and clear. Her favorite color was yellow, and she wore a bright yellow dress that seemed to radiate sunshine. Samuel stood nearby, watching them, his face a portrait of pure, unadulterated joy. The weary lines of fatigue had been replaced by the soft creases of frequent smiles. He was no longer a ghost in the machine, but a pillar of his community. "Higher, Arthur, higher!" Lily squealed with delight. Arthur laughed, a real, deep laugh that came from his soul. He had not felt such uncomplicated happiness in years. He had found what he thought was lost forever, a family. Not one of blood, but one forged in the crucible of kindness and mutual respect. He had learned that true wealth wasn't in the towers we build, but in the bridges we construct to connect our hearts. It was not in the silence of solitude, but in the shared laughter of a child on a sunny afternoon. Looking at Samuel, and then at the small, joyful girl soaring toward the sky, Arthur Vance finally understood. He hadn't just saved a man from sleeping on a cardboard floor. He had been saved from sleeping through his own life. The story of their unlikely friendship became a quiet legend in the halls of the company, a reminder that the most profound changes often begin with a single, small act of seeing the person right in front of you. It taught them all that sometimes, the most valuable person in the entire building isn't the one in the corner office, but the one with the kindest heart and the key to the supply closet.